You won't be needed anymore. Maris, security will escort you out. The words landed like a slap in the hushed elegance of the Windsor suite. 12 CEOs sat in a perfect oval, their polished pens poised over memorandums of understanding worth 1.9 billion warm. Amber light caught the edges of crystal water glasses, the air holding that particular mix of formality and anticipation that only comes when months of negotiation are about to culminate. I had orchestrated every detail, placement cards to balance egos, catering to honor cultural preferences, translation teams on discreet standby. This was my room. And yet, standing in the doorway, Damien Cross wore the smirk of a man who believed he owned it. He didn't lower his voice. He wanted everyone to hear. I caught the faintest movement to my left, Mr. Takahashi, the CEO from Tokyo, giving me a subtle nod. It wasn't sympathy, it was recognition. He knew something. I'd given 15 years to this company, 15 years of red-eye flights and hotel rooms where the minibar was my dinner. I'd missed my parents' 50th anniversary for a Zurich summit that no one else could have salvaged. I spoke enough Mandarin to negotiate without an interpreter, enough German to prevent million-dollar miscommunications. My role wasn't ceremonial. It was the bridge between cultures, contracts, and trust. Damien was the antithesis of everything that built that bridge. Where I listened, he bulldozed. Where I planned for contingencies, he planned photo ops. He'd been in his seat for barely 18 months, riding on deals I'd secured long before he learned how to spell memorandum. He'd told me once, in a hallway where he thought I couldn't hear, that the company needed someone younger, hungrier. Now, in front of 12 of the world's most influential decision-makers, he was cashing in that cruelty for spectacle. I didn't stand immediately. My eyes drifted to my chair, my place, now bearing Damien's leather folio, open to his own notes, as if he'd been rehearsing this takeover for weeks. The warmth in my cheeks wasn't embarrassment. It was the sting of realizing the precision I'd brought to this event had been weaponized to make my removal as public and final as possible. I rose slowly, feeling every gaze in the room. The air no longer felt warm. It felt like winter. I didn't leave the room right away. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the weight of 15 years pressing down on my shoulders, daring me to remember what those years had cost and given. 15 years ago, I was a junior coordinator with a passport full of blank pages and a head full of languages I hadn't quite mastered. Nights were for flashcards, mornings for conference calls with time zones I couldn't yet track without a map. By my third year, I could shift from English to Mandarin to German in the span of a single conversation, catching nuances that saved contracts from collapsing under cultural misunderstandings. Deals were my lifeblood, not the flashy kind with ribbon-cutting ceremonies and champagne flutes, but the hard-earned ones. The 23-hour negotiation in Shanghai that ended with a handshake just minutes before the deadline. The Zurich summit that pulled me from my own 20th wedding anniversary because there was no one else the Swiss team trusted to read the final draft. My marriage didn't survive the years of airports and boardrooms. The company did. That was the difference between me and Damien Cross. I built trust quietly, brick by brick, in a dozen languages and twice as many currencies. Damien built an image, expensive suits, sound bites for internal newsletters, the kind of presence that photographed well but faded fast under pressure. Where I saw deals as bridges, he saw them as podiums. I remembered a moment from last year, sitting across from Henrik Vollmer, CEO of a Berlin-based tech consortium. He'd leaned in during a coffee break and said, "I wouldn't sign a cent of this if your name weren't on it." Maris. It wasn't flattery, it was fact. The ink only dried because they trusted me to guard both sides of the table. And yet, Damien had stood on that very stage months later, receiving an internal Global Excellence Award for that same project, a project that had been minutes from imploding until I caught a mistranslation in the penalty clause at the 11th hour. He never mentioned my name. He never had to. The applause washed over him, and I sat in the back, hands folded, swallowing the knowledge that I'd just saved his career from its first real failure. Now, as I stood in the Windsor suite, the memory burned hotter than the humiliation. I wasn't here because I'd failed. I was here because my success was inconvenient to him, and that was the bitterest truth of all. Damien's ambush in the Windsor suite didn't happen in a vacuum. It had been brewing for months, small, deliberate cuts disguised as strategic changes. The first time he floated the phrase younger energy, it was over coffee in the executive lounge, spoken with that false casualness people use when they're testing how far they can push. The second time, it was a fresh face for the brand, tossed into a budget meeting as if my years of experience had somehow expired. By the third, it had become refreshing our leadership image, a thinly veiled dismissal that no one in the room dared challenge. I'd survived long enough in this industry to recognize when a coup was forming. But what I didn't see, what still burned in my chest, was that Damien wouldn't wait for a clean transition. He would aim for spectacle, and he chose his stage well. Today wasn't just any meeting. It was the day 12 CEOs from across the globe had gathered to sign a $1.9 billion partnership. He knew the cameras would be in the hallway, the assistants on standby, the stakes sky high. He didn't want me quietly replaced in a Monday memo. He wanted my erasure to be part of his debutante ball in front of the most powerful audience he could assemble. 20 minutes before the meeting began, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Clara, one of the few assistants I trusted. "He's brought her. She's in the hall, waiting." I didn't need to ask who her was. The so-called strategic hire Damien had been grooming to take my place. I remember staring at that message, the words swimming. The anger came fast, hot, and instinctive. But years in negotiation rooms had taught me the value of stillness. Rage had to be banked, controlled, sharpened, outwardly. I adjusted my jacket, reviewed the seating plan, and carried on as if nothing had shifted. Inside, the fury pressed against my ribs as I set the final briefing packets in place. A second notification lit my screen. This one wasn't meant for me. It was a forwarded internal email Damien had accidentally copied me on weeks ago. The subject line made my stomach twist. Photo capture, leadership refresh, Windsor event. The body detailed where the photographer should stand to get the best wide shot of the incoming lead replacing the outgoing. Outgoing. Me. I'd read a lot of cynical plays in my career, but this was textbook humiliation choreography. He wanted my removal documented, packaged, and circulated as proof of his visionary leadership. In that moment, the helplessness was almost physical. There was nothing I could do to stop him from walking into that room and staging his power grab. But under the weight of that fury, I clung to a colder truth. He was walking straight into a trap he didn't know existed, and all I had to do was let him. I had known for a long time that Damien would try something. What I didn't know was when, or how bold he would be. That's why the diplomatic clause existed. It had started as a seed of an idea 6 months earlier, during the first preliminary talks for this deal. I'd been in too many negotiations derailed by sudden leadership changes. A handshake meant nothing if the person who made it was gone the next day. So I drafted language that safeguarded both sides. If the principal liaison named in the agreement is replaced or removed at any point before final signing, all memorandums of understanding are automatically void. Simple, neutral. It didn't mention me by name, but in every draft, I was the liaison. Of course, it couldn't be presented as self-protection. That would have raised flags. Instead, I framed it as a matter of respect for the CEO's time and resources. I used every language I had. Soft, persuasive Japanese for Mr. Takahashi, the clipped precision of German for Henrik Fulmer, and the nuanced tones of Mandarin for Li Wei. I explained how this clause wasn't about individuals, but about continuity. You invest months of work, I told them. You deserve to know the person you trust will be there until the ink dries. One by one. They agreed. Some saw it as a safeguard against corporate infighting. Others liked the quiet leverage it gave them. And Damien? He signed off on the contract drafts without a second glance, more interested in the branding mock-ups than the legal text. The clause was buried in paragraph 14, under mutual obligations, a place he never read past the headline. I remember the moment Mr. Takahashi lingered after a call, his voice low in my earpiece. If he tries to push you out, we will leave the table, all of us. There was no bravado in his tone, just a statement of fact. It was the kind of quiet loyalty you can't buy, earned only by showing up, year after year, deal after deal. So, as I stood in the Windsor suite, listening to Damien orchestrate my public removal, my pulse didn't race. I didn't argue. I didn't even look at him. Because while he thought today was his crowning moment, I knew something he didn't. The very act of removing me was the detonator. The clause wasn't an empty threat. It was law, agreed to and signed by every leader in that room. Damien had just voided $1.9 billion with one sentence, and all I had to do was watch it happen. The diplomatic clause was only the first lock. The second was far smaller, far more personal, small enough to fit in the palm of my hand. Every MOU on that table looked final, pages thick with clauses, signatures already in place from each CEO. But those were drafts, legally binding in appearance only. The real enforceable versions required one last thing: my encrypted digital signature. Without it, those documents were little more than expensive paper. That signature wasn't stored on any company server. It lived on a hardware security token, no bigger than a house key, locked inside my leather shoulder bag. I carried it everywhere: Zurich, Tokyo, São Paulo. Even today. The system had been my idea after a near disaster 3 years ago, when a rival firm tried to slip in a falsified approval while I was in transit. I'd worked with our legal team to design a secure signing process. Once my token was plugged in and my passcode entered, the signature would authenticate and timestamp the final contract. If anyone tried to access the files without authorization, the system would send a copy of the attempted intrusion, along with every traceable detail, to my personal attorney. I could feel the weight of that token in my bag as Damien paraded around the Windsor suite. Oblivious. He thought today's humiliation was permanent. He thought my removal had stripped me of every tool, every thread of influence. But influence doesn't vanish when you leave the room. It follows the chain of trust. And I still held the final link. In my mind, I saw the moment this safeguard was born. A year ago, sitting in my attorney's corner office, she'd leaned forward, her voice low but firm. The day he decides to take you down, this will be your insurance. They can't fire your signature. Now, watching Damien shuffle the MOU packets like a dealer in a rigged game, I almost smiled. He could seat his strategic hire in my chair, pose for the photographer, flood the internal channels with headlines about fresh leadership. But the reality was simpler. Without my key, without my code, the deal could not close. The CEOs knew it. Their legal teams knew it. And soon, Damien would know it too. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to stop the meeting. My control wasn't loud. It was quiet, precise, and absolute. Because in a room full of paper, I was the ink. The moment I stood from my chair, the temperature in the Windsor suite seemed to drop. I didn't speak. I didn't protest. I simply stepped aside, sliding my chair in with the same care I'd used to set it hours earlier. That silence had a weight to it, an unspoken signal only those who lived in boardrooms could read. Around the table, pens that had been poised over contracts lowered slowly. Pages that had been spread open were drawn together. closed, stacked neatly. I caught the flicker of eyes meeting eyes across the oval. Damien didn't notice. Or maybe he noticed, but mistook it for deference. He moved into my chair as if it had always been his, flipping through the top MOU like a man already certain of his victory. "Let's proceed," he said, voice full of manufactured confidence. The first few minutes were him reciting boilerplate, trying to re-establish the momentum I'd built. But momentum is fragile. It lives in trust. And the trust in that room had shifted with me when I stepped away. It was the CEO from Oslo who broke the rhythm. He leaned back, his voice calm but direct. "Mr. Cross, could you clarify the scope and application of Clause 17? The question hung in the air. Clause 17 wasn't just a number. It was the keystone that balanced risk allocation across 12 jurisdictions. I had written it, negotiated it, defended it through 14 revisions. Damien had never once been in the room for those debates. I watched him freeze for just a fraction of a second, his eyes darting to the page, scanning for something, anything, that would give him a lifeline. "Well," he began, "Clause 17 addresses the, scope." "Without her," interrupted Henrik Fulmer from Munich, his German accent sharpening each word. "Who ensures our terms are honored?" The question was not rhetorical. It was an indictment. Around the table, subtle movements began. A CEO from Singapore closed her leather folder with a quiet snap. Another from São Paulo capped his pen and set it precisely in the center of his pad. The Oslo CEO didn't break his gaze from Damien. From the periphery of the room came a softer shift. 2 interpreters, both of whom had been stationed behind their respective clients, quietly gathered their headsets and notebooks. They walked toward the door without a word. Moments later, one of the legal aides followed. The sound of the door closing behind them was louder than it should have been. Damien's tone faltered, his sentences thinning into half-formed phrases. He flipped pages too quickly, as if speed could mask ignorance. The silence in the room wasn't empty. It was full of calculation, full of unspoken conclusions, full of the knowledge that this meeting was no longer moving toward a signature, but toward an exit. I stayed where I was, a few steps back from the table, my bag over my shoulder, my hands clasped loosely. I didn't need to speak to be heard. In rooms like this, silence was a language all its own, and right now, it was saying everything. The silence broke not with a cough or a shuffle, but with the scrape of a chair leg against polished marble. The CEO from Oslo rose slowly, smoothing the front of his tailored jacket. His expression was neutral, but his voice carried the precision of a verdict. "As per the diplomatic clause," he said evenly, "our memorandum is now void. Without the named liaison, there is no agreement." It wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. The words landed like a gavel in the center of the table. For a moment, Damien didn't move. He seemed to think he could negotiate this the way he did everything, by pretending the words hadn't been spoken. "We can still move forward," he began, gesturing toward the folders. "We have consensus on the—" But Oslo was already closing his folder, slipping it into his briefcase. Without another glance, he walked toward the door. That was the crack in the dam. From the far side, the CEO from São Paulo stood, muttering something to his aide in Portuguese before following Oslo. The Singapore delegate leaned to her interpreter, nodded once, and began gathering her papers. Damien's voice rose, a brittle edge creeping in. "If we could all just, please, sit down. We can resolve any concerns." They didn't even look at him. I stayed still, hands folded loosely in front of me, my bag resting against my hip. This was not my fight to win anymore. I had already won the moment Damien removed me. Now, I was simply watching the inevitable play out. Henrik Vollmer from Munich moved next. He walked the length of the table, his hand extended, not to Damien, but to me. His grip was firm, steady. "You were always the deal," he said quietly, his eyes locking with mine for a beat before he released my hand and turned toward the door. It was an affirmation, not just of my work, but of the years of trust built across continents. And Damien heard it. I could see the way his jaw tightened, the flicker of something, anger, maybe panic behind his eyes. Near the end of the table, the CEO from Toronto rose, but didn't take her pen with her. She set it down in the center of her open folder, ink tip facing away from her. In certain circles, that gesture was understood. The pen left behind meant the deal was over. Permanently. Damien saw it too. He stepped toward her, voice cracking slightly. "We can fix this. Just give me—" The door closed behind her before he could finish. One by one, the seats emptied, the air shifting from tense to hollow. What remained at the table were untouched glasses of water, scattered translation headsets, and the faint echo of shoes on marble fading into the hallway. I didn't smile, not outwardly, but somewhere deep inside, beneath the calm facade I'd worn all morning, there was a slow, steady pulse of satisfaction, the kind that comes when the truth doesn't need defending, because it's already walking out the door. I was halfway down the marble hallway when the first raised voice reached me. Even without turning back, I knew it was Damien. His tone was sharp, brittle, the kind of edge that comes when control has already slipped away. I slowed my pace, pretending to check my phone while the words carried through the half-open conference doors. "Get legal on the line, now!" Chairs scraped. Someone fumbled with the speakerphone. From my position just beyond the threshold, I could hear the clipped voice of our chief counsel through the crack. "Damien, without the named liaison's participation at final signing, Clause 14 voids all MOUs, and without her encrypted signature, the system will not authenticate the contracts." There was a pause, long enough for me to picture the look on his face. Then his reply, low and strained. "We'll override it." "You can't," the lawyer said. "It's hard-coded. Even attempting to bypass would trigger legal alerts." Silence. Then the faint click of a laptop opening, followed by a groan I recognized instantly. He must have been staring at the message I'd known would be there. Final signature missing. Contract invalid. I took a slow breath. This was the part of the game I never had to play out loud. The next sound was an email notification ping, sharper than the rest. I didn't need to see it to know it was bad. My gut told me so. A moment later, one of the junior staff emerged, phone in hand, whispering to another as they hurried past me. The words floated back in fragments. "From Oslo, sent to the board, said they don't work with instability." It was almost too perfect. I lingered near the elevator bank, just out of sight, catching pieces of Damien's frantic instructions. Draft a statement, market stability, strong leadership. No one says void. No one says withdrawal. His voice kept rising, as if volume could rewrite reality. But reality was already moving faster than him. I watched the PR lead exit the room, her face pale, her notepad clutched like a shield. Then another staffer left, murmuring something about checking with their team. The hallway grew quieter with each set of departing footsteps. By the time I stepped into the elevator, I could still hear Damien inside, pacing, his words tangled with half-formed plans. The doors slid shut, cutting off the sound completely. For a moment, I let myself smile, just a small, private acknowledgement. I didn't need to see the panic to know exactly what it looked like. I'd spent years in negotiation rooms. I could recognize collapse by its rhythm, and in that rhythm, I could hear the truth. He hadn't just lost the deal, he'd handed it to me. The cold air outside the building felt sharper than I expected, cutting through the adrenaline that had carried me out of the Windsor suite. I walked slowly down the granite steps, each one a little lighter than the last. The deal was gone for Damien. For me, it was simply Shifting form. Halfway across the plaza. My phone buzzed in my hand. The caller ID glowed with a name I knew well. Takahashi, CEO of the Tokyo firm. I stepped aside, letting a stream of pedestrians pass, and answered. Maris-san. His voice came warm and steady, not the formal tone he used in conference calls. I believe you have already heard the outcome inside? I have, I said. Good, he replied, almost with a hint of satisfaction. We would like you to serve as our direct advisor for the next phase of this project, not as an employee of your company, as an independent, full authority on negotiations, and the budget to match. I felt the weight of his words settle in. Independent, full authority. Those weren't just terms, they were a declaration. That's generous, I said carefully. It's deserved, he said. Without you, there is no foundation for trust. We want the foundation. We spoke for another few minutes, sketching the outline of what would become my new role. The compensation was more than comfortable, higher than I'd ever earned under Damien's leadership, and the autonomy was absolute. When the call ended, my phone vibrated again, almost immediately. This time, it was a text. Henrik Vollmer, Munich. If you're available, we'd like to bring you on to lead our portion of the venture. Conditions same as before, only if you're at the helm. 2 offers in less than 10 minutes. My steps slowed. This wasn't just about salvaging my career. It was about reclaiming the position I had always truly held, even when my title didn't say it. A third notification appeared, this one from an unfamiliar number. The message was brief but unmistakable in its leverage. We are prepared to sign once Maris Halloway is confirmed as lead negotiator. The sender's name followed, a major institutional investor I knew had been on the fence for months. I stood there for a moment, the city noise blurring around me, in the space of a single morning. Damien had managed to lose the confidence of the global boardroom, while I had been handed the keys to it. It wasn't loud. This victory. There were no cameras, no headlines, at least not yet. But it was complete. And it was mine. I slipped the phone back into my bag and kept walking. Not toward the subway, but toward the quiet cafe a few blocks away. It seemed like the right place to start drafting my own terms, for my own future. After years of building bridges for someone else to walk across, I was finally the one deciding where they led. And this time, I wasn't letting anyone else hold the map. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows felt different here, warmer somehow, as if it were shining on a chapter I'd fought too long to reach. My new office wasn't extravagant, but every inch of it was mine. The desk was uncluttered, my leather notebook open to fresh pages, and my laptop sat ready, displaying the draft contract for the international venture I was now leading, for the first time in years. I wasn't bracing for someone to knock and pull me into a fight I hadn't started. Today, I was the one calling the meetings. A soft knock broke my thoughts. When the door opened, it wasn't an assistant. It was Henrik Vollmer, the CEO from Munich. He stepped in with the same measured confidence I'd seen in boardrooms. But his expression carried something I'd never seen before. Personal respect. Maris, he said, placing a folder on my desk. This is the finalized MOU for the joint venture. We've all signed. Yours is the last signature. I opened it slowly, and there it was. My name, printed cleanly at the top of the leadership page, not buried in footnotes or legal acknowledgments, but standing in bold under the title Chief Negotiation Advisor. This time, there was no one to override it, no hidden agenda waiting to erase it. I stood, walking with him into the adjacent conference room. The chair at the head of the table was larger than the one in the Windsor suite. When I sat down, I couldn't help but remember the sharp scrape of my old chair being taken from me that day. The difference now was undeniable. This table was longer, the view broader, and the faces around it, more CEOs than had ever gathered in that room, were here because they wanted me here. As the conversation began, my hand brushed something at the corner of the table. I looked down to see a sleek, black Mont Blanc pen. Recognition hit immediately. It was the one Henrik had left behind on the Windsor suite table as a quiet symbol that the deal was over without me. "Thought you should have it," Henrik said quietly, leaning closer so only I could hear. "It belongs to the person who kept the deal honest." I turned the pen in my hand, feeling the weight of it, not in grams, but in years. Years of flights, negotiations, sacrifices, and quiet endurance. Years where the victories had always belonged to someone else in the press releases. Until now, when it came time to sign. The room was still, no camera flashes, no staged applause, just the sound of pen on paper, anchoring my roll in ink no one could remove. I capped the pen, setting it gently on the table in front of me. For the first time, the victory wasn't about proving Damien wrong. It was about proving myself right all along. And as I looked around the room, I knew this wasn't just a full circle. It was a larger circle, one I had drawn myself.